Well, welcome, and I hope you've enjoyed the sessions as much as I did so far, particularly the one with Max Strooms. I'm actually amazed at how much knowledge he can retain in his head. It's quite remarkable, and I really enjoyed that session. I hope you did too. So before I set the scene today on this session, let's start with some introductions. I'll kick things off. So I'm Kyle. I'm a senior principal here at DataGuard in the information security team, and I've been with DataGuard for 2.5 years now. Having previously set up our professional services team in the UK, I've also spent some time in product, focusing on product content for our platform, but nowadays I can be found with our corporate customers, helping them with their infosec frameworks and their ISO 27001 needs, and also some pre-sales. But I'm joined today by two fantastic guest speakers. We have both Will and Mike. Will and I have actually had the pleasure of working with each other before in the past. So Will, if I can ask you to introduce yourself to the round and then pass to Mike when you're done.
Excellent, thanks. Morning, afternoon, almost everybody, so great to meet you. So I'm Will. I've spent 25 years or so in IT management. I spent the last 8 years in defensive security, actually where I was working with Kyle. And on that side, it's all about spending money on the tools, the process, the people. And we all do that, and people still get breached every single day. Bad things happen. So I've moved over. So I'm now on the offensive side, at a company called CovertSwarm, and we basically do illegal things every day. They're only illegal for the fact that people pay us to do them against themselves. So we socially manipulate people. We'll try and steal from their bank accounts. We'll break into their offices. We'll steal laptops. We'll do everything a criminal would do to get in, all to help them actually make sure are their protection and their goals effective in what they do. So we'll go through the questions, but I'd love to speak to you all later as well.
Hi, I'm Mike Washington. Well, I've got to say, getting paid to do illegal things every day sounds like a brilliant job. Mike Washington, similarly about 25 years in enterprise IT. I've worked for companies such as SAP, Oracle, Informatica, The last 9 years have been in data privacy. So working with organizations, both pre and post GDPR, to help them reach certain thresholds in terms of how they deal with, collect, store, use, transmit data. The company I work for is called Anonos. We're a US-based startup. We bring to that set of requirements around privacy something completely new and different that was architected for the modern privacy world. So we come at the problem in a different way to how it was traditionally done. What I'm really interested in terms of this conversation, and I hope it's interesting for you as well, is how the world of security and Will's particular area and the world of privacy actually merge to the greater good and benefit of everybody, be it citizens, be it businesses, whomever, because there's enormous opportunity there. And traditionally, these things just don't really blend. So thanks for having us, and looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So we're really here today to explore this idea of an ever-evolving threat landscape and the use of artificial intelligence to effectively enhance the sophistication and the techniques used by hackers and the way which they're exploiting this technology. So the theme is very topical, as it always has been. I think if we look in the news, there's always very recent headlines on data breaches and various high-profile cyber attacks that have been successful. I mean, just this weekend alone, the UK Royal Family's website was hacked. They claim it wasn't actually a data breach, but they had a denial of service attack just this weekend. September just gone, we had another very targeted attack on UK public services in that the UK police force had data leaked, which is something we've already seen in places like Northern Ireland, so that's just a very common theme that we're seeing. I think we look at the threat landscape from a global lens, but I think actually in the UK it's even more of a higher value target now for cyber criminals. And to answer that question, I really have to just quote something I read from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, where they highlighted that UK businesses and our institutions are at the foremost in the world, meaning they've got three things that hackers and attackers are looking for. So that's money, it's information, and then thirdly, it's the potential to cause that widespread damage if things do go wrong, and they do go wrong, as we know. So this is a talking point that will continue later on the roundtable around 2 o'clock just next door. But this is Epic UK, so we really want to keep this conversation about the UK threat landscape as opposed to a global lens. We'll touch on both, but really kind of doubling down on the UK side of things. So just before we get into the questions, I've noticed there's a nice comfy seat for me there, which I'll sit down on in a minute. Is this session we've broken down into 3 distinct parts. So we've got this idea of what are the security pain points that we're solving for our customers, and I think we've all got 3 quite individual perspectives there. Secondly, we're going to look at the threat landscape in general, and then we're going to go into this question of does frameworks and standards drive security, or is it vice versa? And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So, moving on. The first question, I'm going to direct to the Will. I mean, Will, you've just said you've got a very good perspective from the defensive and the offensive side of security. So from your lens, you're paid to do criminal things. This is a really interesting take on security. But what are you doing for your customers? What are you seeing from your standpoint?
I think it goes back to actually one of the things that I saw earlier was probably the most appropriate. When you look at NIST 2, so that's just coming out. I think the second line there was appropriate versus effectiveness. And I think that's really the journey that everybody in security and compliance, and I think it is one bundle, we are all in this together, is going on that journey. I think if you look at a naive business, somebody that hasn't actually gone through the route of being compliant, well, do they actually have appropriate controls? No. And that's, of course, what you do using tools like DataGuard and actually going through things like ISO. They get you to a point where you've actually got appropriate controls. The challenge that you've got in security today, and really when you look at these things, is what's the measure of effectiveness on these? And that often isn't actually tested. People actually put these things in place, and whilst in a room you can go, well, this looks appropriate, when you actually push and test it, does it work? And often it's the case that that's no. I think if you look at something, whilst it's not in the UK, MGM, the big casino company, was completely taken down for nigh on a week. And actually, when you look at it, were they compliant? Of course they would have been compliant in everything they do. They're a great big gambling brand. Every one of us knows that brand. But were those controls effective? My goodness, no, were they? Actually, when you look at how they were breached, it was actually quite naive. Frankly, one person got into one person, and that one person had the keys to the entire MGM kingdom to be able to lock everything down. Absolutely woeful, really, on the way that it looks from everything that we've been told. And that's really the thing on this is everybody's going through a journey of maturity. And when we look at this from compliance and controls, they all help guide us in the way of where do we need to go. But really that step that we do need to go to, and I think NIST 2 is a prime example of this, of actually checking these controls and really testing them to breaking point. And the thing that we always, that I often come back to, if you look at Titanic, right? Titanic was compliant. Did it mean that bad things didn't happen? Of course it didn't, right? Terrible things happened there. So it's the case of, did it have appropriate lifeboats? Maybe. Were they effective? Goodness me, no. Likewise, the things we've all seen in the movie where the water gates come down. Great engineering invention. So did they actually help when the disaster struck? No, they didn't, because they weren't actually tested to the point where they need to be. And that's really our thing on this, is everything you build and theorize is great. What you need to do is test them and ensure that they're appropriate for your business. And I think going back from what you said, Carl, right? From our perspective, we look at things like an illegal trying to get into your business. So what we think is, how could we steal money? How could we steal your payroll? How could we stop you operationally? How could we hold you to ransom? How could we damage your brand? How could we stop you team working? All of those things is how criminals work. And that's really the way that you need to think of it. The controls that you put in place, don't think about building a bigger wall. Think about it also from the outside in. Where are the gaps? Because it's those gaps where the criminals will get in.
Yeah, thank you, Morrish. So would you say it's, it's always on, it's hacking as a service? What is that in relation to pen testing? I mean, there's some synergy there. I know you hate to be referred to as pen testers, but to some extent you are looking at some of their, sort of their CREST criteria, but how are you kind of going above and beyond the requirement of pen testing? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think when you look at pen testing, by its nature, it's an insular way of working. You, as a business, say, well, I need a pen test because my customers ask it, or I need it as a piece of paper to hand to somebody. So that pen test will be, we'll test my website and maybe do an internal test. Well, that's probably 5% of your overall addressable risk that you've got within your business. So that's quite different. So, of course, we'll do those things because those are attack vectors that you've got. But as a business, your attack vectors are massive. For instance, if somebody can walk into your office and just get onto your network and then get straight onto your finance system without needing to get on your VPN, without needing to phish somebody, well, they've got so much deeper into your network already. So it's about actually taking that view of what would an attacker do, what's the lowest risk, highest outcome achievement that an attacker could actually do. And of course, yeah, we do cover the bases that typically you would do within a pen test, but it is so much more than that. It's how do you manipulate people? How do you manipulate the other pieces of technology? I think when you ask, one of the things we do is say, well, what have you had pen tested? Well, our website. We can then look and we go, oh, so you've got your staging, your development. Oh, I can see you've got a HR platform over here. None of these things are pen tested on an annual basis, yet every one of them is a key to the kingdom in one other way. So it covers it, but it's only a small portion of the wider context that we cover.
Yeah. That's great, thank you. So Mike, similar question to you. How are you kind of bridging those two worlds? What are the pain points you're solving for your customers from a security lens, but obviously Anonos being more around data hygiene, data solutions, pseudonymization, etc. So how are you bridging those two worlds together currently?
So, I mean, the communities we all come from, I mean, traditionally it's a very broad church of kind of beliefs, experience areas, knowledge, and traditionally I think some of us are wedded to what we specialize in. But actually the need to protect personal information spans all of it. So we come at this from a slightly different perspective. Our focus is on the data itself, and it's driven by global compliance and regulation. What's the problem with that? Well, compliance is not a really sexy word. You know, people are not terribly interested. It doesn't matter which church you come from. So we have to think about it slightly differently. So on the one hand, and this does tie into what Will says, and this is where we have quite a big crossover. We look at data and the protection of that data as the last line of defense. So if all else fails, if an attacker is trying to access information, what they get to is essentially worthless. The flip side of that is, if data has been rendered worthless, you can't actually do anything with it. So you're storing stuff you can't use, so the utility is completely lost. So what Anonos brings to that is methods and techniques which allow the utility to be maintained or retained or indeed enhanced. The types of problems we see coming up quite frequently are, there's three, I suppose. There's many, but there's three really key ones. So we find organizations who are creating and receiving huge amounts of data all the time. And because of the regulations of where they are, they need to do something to it to make it legally useful. So we kind of call that, and it's not it's kind of ubiquitous language, but we call that shift-left privacy. So applying privacy privacy solutions right at the beginning of a data flow, so that once it's within an organization, it's never going to drop out of that we are compliant bucket. Makes DPOs very happy. Then there are organizations who are sitting on huge volumes of data. They've been collecting, telcos are a very good example of this. So they've been collecting information for 15, 20 years. It's being stored in what we would now refer to as legacy architectures such as Hadoop. And in order to meet certain privacy thresholds, those architectures have to contain protected data, but to actually do it is almost impossible because the volumes are so high that as soon as you apply protections to that data, you slow everything down, and then your business users start shouting at you. And then lastly, we're seeing a lot of people who are broadly in the data use, the secondary data use area, who again want to make use of information. They've navigated all the controls that are already there, they're accessing it properly, but once they start to access it, it actually is being unlawful the way it's being dealt with, and that's a lot of kind of what Max Schrems is talking about. So we kind of see last line of defense and then enhancing utility around data whilst meeting lawful thresholds.
Understood. Thank you for that explanation. It's really, really interesting. So let's pivot into the next point, which is a more broader topic on the landscape in particular. So when I think of trends and reports, I think there are some very common items that take the top spot there. So I'm talking about things like ransomware, I'm talking about phishing, zero-day. they've been there for the last 5 years. But I think generally speaking, I wanted to narrow down things into what we're seeing in the UK, as opposed to just this global lens that we tend to look at the threat landscape through. So from my standpoint, and actually, Convention Tom has already mentioned this, but it's this topic of a skill shortage, and it's the human threat that still remains to be a huge challenge. And just to name a couple of statistics, and we had a more of a global a stat earlier, but still there's 50% of businesses in the UK now have a basic cyber gap, skill gap in their organisations, and then a further 33% have a more advanced cyber gap. Those numbers haven't really changed since 21 and 22 respectively. They've been pretty similar, but what I found really staggering was this notion around, in the last 12 months, there's been 160,000 cyber and infosec job postings, of which only 140,000 are filled. So that's led to the biggest shortfall that we've actually seen so far. So from your side, I'm sure you agree that humans they've always been this notoriously weak link in a supply chain, or in a security chain rather, due to things like lack of awareness and falling victim to social engineering attacks. But now what I find really staggering is that humans are now adding a whole new flavour of risk to the threat landscape, in that there's just simply not enough professionals to solve these challenges that we're seeing in this space. So Will, you see this stuff day in, day out. What if you were to knock off the top spot of ransomware or social engineering? What is the in thing right now? What are we talking about? What is the most prominent trend you're seeing in 2023?
Humans just don't employ anybody and you'll be inherently secure, basically. They're always the ones that make the mistake. I think there are always issues as to whether they're doing the right things to protect, defend, or otherwise. I think with regards to the cyber skills gap, I think that's always going to be there. I think the thing that we see in the last 20 years, you see it in every industry, there's a cyclical, well, we're going to outsource the problem, we're going to insource the problem. And I think when you look at something like the cyber skills gap, it's because we're going through a bit of a wave of people are starting to insource a little bit more. I'd argue, actually, if I was CTO or CIO running a business, actually, I'd outsource quite a lot of the cyber challenges to external companies to actually help with things like detection and response and other pieces, but it's then making sure that you're able to ensure that those controls are actually correct. But I think going back into risk, it is always going to be the people. And I think people will always do silly things, not because they're silly, just because we're human. We are fallible by our nature. So the challenge I think that needs to be addressed by most businesses is doing things like phishing training is a worthwhile endeavour. But I think for any of you, I'm sure most of you have got things like Know Before in your businesses. If you're a business of 500 people or 1,000 people, you're talking in the boardroom and going, it's great, we've gone and reduced our phishing click rate from 14% to 6%. And if you're 1,000 people, that's still 60 people a month are doing something silly. So it's still a lot of people. You are by no means protected against this. So the thing that you need to do is protect against the human elements by making sure your defences aren't just one blooming great big wall around your business. So you need to take assumed points of compromise. People will click on something stupid. So when they do, what happens? What can an adversary do if they get onto one of your developers' laptop or onto one of your customer service agents' laptop? What can they do? If somebody, like with MGM, if somebody breaches one of your IT admins, how much damage could they actually inflict? Test from that point, and then you can then start to mitigate those risks in other ways, instead of it just being the initial point of entry, which I think these days are actually quite well defended, apart from the humans. You can't change the human piece, so you need to add in secondary and tertiary levels of defence that really stops the risk, because people will always do something silly.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, anything to add from your side on that one?
Yeah, I mean, just from the human perspective, it is, I think probably we haven't reached that kind of point at which the burn factor has reached enough people yet for it to have started to change. It probably will do eventually. But if you consider, just human behaviour, I berate my son endlessly for dumping quasi-identifiable information into Reddit all the time. It's like, what that, Finn, look at that. What you've just done is identify me through your Reddit. I didn't want to be put there. So that kind of behavior is just, because it's giving him interest and pleasure. He doesn't consider that. And I think you can just see that's the way we are as human beings. To the point around recruitment, I mean, all I'll say is it is extremely hard to hire people, to find the right people for the business we have. It's one of those things, the market is good if you're a seller. And so the wage requests are very high, and the pool of talent is quite small, at least the pool of talent that we're after. So, that's going to continue for a little while. And I think we probably just haven't reached that kind of peak point in the kind of evolution of the problems that we're trying to solve. I'm sure if give it a few years, we'll just be able to type it into chat and we'll get the answer we want.
I think you raised an interesting point there, actually, about the context of this. I think that's one of the things that's often missing when you're talking about compliance, and compliance might not be the sexiest thing, but I think bringing it down to somebody's role of why is this stuff important. So one of the examples that we'll often do is we'll breach a customer and we'll attack them, and it might be through phishing or some other route. And just saying to somebody, don't click on that link or don't do this, well, actually, the change you're going to incite in a person is probably not going to be that great. So what we'll do is we'll break in, and if we did something targeted, say, a finance team, we'll then actually break into their Sage or whatever their finance platform is, then set up Mickey Mouse as a payee for £1 million. And you get to the point of being able to press play on transferring £1 million. You then go in and talk to the finance team and say, this is why this is dangerous. And they actually see that you've logged in with their username to do this. How on earth did you do that? The context of the danger is then appropriate to the person. And then that really does change how people are reacting to this and go, right, now I understand the implications of these things that you're asking me not to do, rather than just asking them not to do them, just like with your son, really.
Yeah, I think actually you've already mentioned it. You said we'll just put it into chat and see what happens. I think that's a pretty good segue into the next point here, which is we're going to explore now how has AI been leveraged to enhance the sophistication of attacks. I think 2023 there's been it's been a pretty big upheaval in the rise of artificial intelligence, not only for the ways in which it's being used to defend people. I think Thomas and Kavanch touched on that, to solve real-world cyber challenges, but also in reverse to actually manipulate and actually give more clout and power behind what was otherwise quite a basic social engineering attack. And that's a slightly loaded question, Will, because I know you've already spoken to me about this in the past, around this use case that CovertSwarm have and how you're able to use social engineering and AI to manipulate one of your customers. So perhaps you can just tell the audience a bit more about that fun story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think AI, there are a huge amount of benefits for it. I think all of us have used ChatGPT, or most people have, of where you go, right, I've got to write a blooming long document. I know the salient points. I can either spend 2 hours on it, or I can get the broad context of this and then tidy it up. It's really good for doing that. And I think there's a mix of where AI will massively help us, and it certainly does mean that you can create content and do things in a more effective way. But then there are risks to it. So I've never said these words. Hopefully this will come through the microphone.
Can you get it to get me to say, hi, I'm Will Morrish and I'm selling the British nuclear codes. Can you please reset my password and...
So it sounds like a slightly more privately educated version of me, but alas. So I've genuinely never said those words. That was from 40 seconds of me reading the first couple of paragraphs of A Tale of Two Cities. So it was nothing more than that. So anybody that I speak to today, and I promise I will not record you, I absolutely promise it, but all we need is about 40 seconds of your voice to then convincingly send back and give your voice to anybody. And this is a really interesting one when you think about things like compliance or process. How much of transactions in a business are put through a secondary communication method to say, I've authorised this payment, I've done this. Well, it's really bloody difficult these days when your boss can call you up and say, can you send through that payment? And they'll send you a WhatsApp voicemail. And it's their voice asking you to do something, and they've gone and sent you an email, because you were hacked that way as well, asking you to do something. It creates a huge amount of challenges now of trust but verify when you're talking to people is going to get really difficult. And actually, I don't think all the solutions are there yet. I don't think the risks are the risks are certainly there. I don't think the attacks are starting to creep yet. I think in the next year they absolutely will do. I think if I was running a finance department where you've got money going in and money going out, and a phone call from a boss can create or start a transaction when it's a WhatsApp, a text message, or an email is the secondary form of authentication, businesses are going to be at a huge amount of risk of this. And that's one of the ways where AI is definitely going to change the security paradigm in the next year. fundamentally so. And I think it then goes back to how do you build processes to check against this? And you then get into weird things like, okay, well, so what do? We now need a third factor method? So you're calling me, okay, what's my special secret password that somebody wouldn't know? It's funny, we're all going to have to work through these things. How on earth do we do it? But yeah, we've successfully breached customers by it. So we'll call up, we'll leave a voicemail to somebody on the normal IT team from the CTO. I've bloody lost my phone, I've just got a new iPhone, I need to do this, can you reset my MFA token? And people do it. It's my boss's boss's boss asking me to do something. Of course I'm going to do it. They do it, and we breach just like the bad guys do.
That's scary, but also really, really interesting. Thank you very much. Mike, I'll turn this question to you. And Will, this originally came from your standpoint, but I think, given the crossover with both of these parallels, I think we can definitely both talk about this in some detail. So let's leave the audience with some more practical takeaways when we're thinking about the risk landscape in general, not just artificial intelligence, but not one specific topic, but a broader topic. What information security standards are your customers talking about, if any, and does compliance and standards drive information security, or is it vice versa? Do you have a view on that, Mike, at all?
I don't think it does. I wish it did. I'm sure we'll get to a point of parity at some point in the future, but I don't think it does. Now this might just be my opinion, probably isn't even my company's opinion, but I don't think something gets adopted until it hurts, and that's why, Will's example there is absolutely fantastic. It takes a few seconds, and suddenly you've generated something which is going to fool pretty much everybody, let's be honest. So I think that the principles of the compliance landscape that we see pretty much across the world, but it's very much equivalent in the UK, data minimization principles, or what is called privacy by design, the right to be forgotten, or data destruction rights, and then the application of principles to manage the way data is shared and transmitted. Those things drive a lot of really good conversations, and there is distinct crossover between the kind of principles that Will's world is trying to resolve with ours. What I think also, though, is that no matter how quickly our developers improve our product, or organizations, the communities within the cybersecurity, information security world come together, the technology is going so quickly, or indeed the law changes. Let's forget about the law. It's never going to move fast enough to keep up with the technology. But the technology changes so quickly that we've actually really got to see a little bit into the future now. And where's the horizon in 2 years, and plan for that, because there's already so much data out there. There's so many ways to get at it. There's so much, oversharing, that current technology it is the Wild West almost, and then you get, you can create voices in seconds, and it overcomes any regulation and planning or legal cases or everything.
That's really interesting. And Will, I know you feel particularly strongly about this. I believe that you think it should drive, but what is your take on the question of, does compliance and standards drive security, or is it simply the other way around?
They're both sides of the same coin. Fundamentally, it's trying to keep the business more safe, more secure, and get to a better state. I find it very interesting that when we try and talk to businesses, if we speak to the CTO or the CISO, we have a great, valid conversation. Bearing in mind what we do, if we ever try and speak to the DPO or anybody involved in compliance, they don't give a monkeys. It's their job, which is terrible, in being frank about it, that you go, well, actually, it's their job to make sure that the stuff that I'm doing works. And that's just from experience of what we tend to see. I think for most businesses, send your CISO and your DPO on holiday together. Get them there. Get them to go, this is what our joint strategy is. They're two sides of the same coin that I think it's unfortunate now that they don't feel that they work as closely as together in most businesses that I've seen. I think they will do. I think trust but verify in the way of actually checking that compliance is working, I think inherently will mean that these teams come together. But I think on a wider perspective, I do think that still security is still getting to a level of maturity in businesses that isn't quite there. It's almost becoming truly board level. I think Australia has just updated its laws over there. I believe it's now a directorial responsibility for cybersecurity, which is quite different to the UK, of truly being, you could end up in jail if you don't actually take full appropriate controls on this. So I think we will get there. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You just said information security maturity curve not quite there. I think actually I'm seeing something similar in NIST too. We've already discussed it in previous sessions, and it is following a very similar trend to the GDPR in that the maturity is still fairly low. But I read a study that's out of the SANS Institute, and it looked at 700 businesses this year, and budgets for internal control systems for things like critical service providers has decreased in the last 2 years instead of increased. So I think that sort of suggests that people still need that awareness, and it's still very much a topic that needs to be conversed. We need to educate each other on it and keep it front of mind. Those 700 businesses were global. They were different sizes. They were across energy. They were across health. They were across utilities and gas. So everything that NIST2 hits in terms of being an essential or important service provider, these companies seem to be not making huge investments in those very controls that are protecting that critical infrastructure. So I found that really interesting. And if anyone wants that report, come to me in the break. I can send it to you. It's really a really interesting read. So just looking at the time, Mike, we've probably got one more question. I want to give the audience one more takeaway, and it's, how do we start to defend against some of these threats? And from your standpoint, where does things like good data management and hygiene play a part in all this? So more specifically, how do we bring cybersecurity and data management closer together within an enterprise?
So from my perspective, and try and keep it brief, the principles that are laid out in GDPR around privacy by design are the best way of minimizing the attack surface of your data. If there ever was a good housekeeping way of doing it, that is the way of doing it. And you can see in the regulations that other places around the world have adopted, they have gone with exactly the same method, whether it's in India, Saudi Arabia, California, Brazil, you name it. They all say do the same thing. So my advice to organizations seeking to look at this from a data perspective is adopt that as a principle in all of your data affairs, and then use it as the opportunity to coalesce your different stakeholders around the objective. I think organizations will find, and I've seen it work, that is a really good way forward.
Excellent. So I think we've reached time. We do have a Q&A session that we can do now if people do have questions. I'd like to extend my thanks to both Will and Mike for joining us today and for the insights.
Well, thank you.